take it.
So hello everyone, this is our second hangout on Detering's The Fabricated Paul. And I think last time we were talking we didn't finish chapter 1, and I think we stopped at about page 50 of this PDF. And at that point it is, I believe, summarizing the Dutch radical scholars and just the history of them, if I believe right.
Yeah, and
the radical Dutchmen.
Unfortunately, he doesn't go into much detail into their arguments, which is unfortunate because it's important to Detering's case.
Yeah.
But it's kind of important that you go read Van Manen and Lohmann and these other people that he's talking about.
Yeah. He mentions Allard Pearson and Bollard and
Van Insignia.
Yeah, Van Insignia, yeah.
So unfortunately,
Leon's probably more familiar with the history of these authors than I am, so it might be best for him to summarize this section.
Well, yeah, I think in the last episode of the Hangout, I pointed to the Journal of Higher Criticism website, which I think was edited by Robert Price, or he's the main dude on that one, and it contains several essays mostly by Van Manen, but a couple of other ones by some of these people that we just mentioned. Van Insignia is one of them. And they're worthwhile reading, and I think that what I agree with in Detering's book and thesis mostly revolves around the acceptance of these scholars' scholarship, the reasoning behind why they don't think that any of the Pauline corpus is quote-unquote authentically Pauline. Last week we got into a little discussion about how Reuven saw the same author behind the Voorhalfbrief of F.C. Bauer. The Dutch radicals went even further and concluded that none of them. And the main thing it was authentic, but the main thing to keep in mind about their criticism is that they used essentially the same techniques that the Tübingen school had used to determine that Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians are the ones that are attributed to Paul as the seven are not authentic. And it's unfortunate that he doesn't go into too much detail because it's kind of important to his case. And one of the criticisms that I have about Detering's book at this point is that the amount of time that he should have spent on delineating the arguments of the Dutch radical school, he should have devoted it to that instead of devoting it to his, he did I don't know how long it took him, but 2 pages to describe how he went to the library to go find Antiqua Mater by Edwin Johnson. Which is, it's a good book, and I'm glad that he led me to read this book, and I enjoyed the book, and it's a good book. But to me, it kind of sounded like, why is he doing this? It was kind of very superfluous, in my opinion. It was like a travel log instead of, he veered way off track for a moment, for 2-3 pages.
Yeah, I noticed that also. But anyway, can you give us your own chronological summary of the Dutch radicals? Who was first and how they responded to each other?
Oh boy, okay. Obviously, we have to start with the Tübingen School, which FBR founded. F.C. Bauer, sorry. F.C. Bauer founded. Later, though, the most famous Dutch radical, the most vocal, infamous one was Bruno Bauer. The first one, though, I think was Lohmann, if I'm not mistaken, and Pearson. I'm not looking at anything, so I'm just kind of going off the top of my head. But I think it was Lohmann and Pearson, followed by Bruno Bauer, who was the most vocal. followed by W.C. Van Manen, who in my opinion is somebody who's really worth reading. Dr. Price has a volume in which it's an anthology of his English writings with a foreword and an introduction by Robert Price. And I guess it's hard to go into detail as to what their specific arguments were. They're basically the same arguments that Detering is hinting at. They revolve around the concept that the things that the letters concern themselves with fit more the Sitzen Leben of the early second century than it does for the first. And a lot of these things, obviously, are some of the Marcionite concerns that we all know are in, well, at least me and Wayne accept, that are in the Pauline letters. Some of the Gnostic concepts that are in the Pauline letters. All of these things are evidence, or at least one of the lines of reasoning goes. All of these things are evidence that the Pauline corpus fits better the Sitzen Leben of the early second century than it does the 50s and 60s, which consensus says that they come from. Eventually, what the Dutch school is mostly known for is they basically for saying that none of the Pauline letters are authentic. But somebody like Bruno Bauer, and I believe it was Lohmann who first posited that because partly due to the fact that none of the Pauline letters are authentic, also leads to the conclusion that therefore the historical Jesus is probably just a myth as well. And the first person to do that, I think, was Lohmann, and Van Manen followed, but not Van Manen. Bruno Bauer followed, but Bruno Bauer was really an interesting, very charismatic or anti-charismatic personality who teed off a lot of people in his time. He got fired from his teaching position for teaching a mythicist position, basically. Then after that, W.C. Van Manen tried to salvage what Bruno Bauer was seen as too radical, but he still maintained in the inauthenticity of the Paulines. And later, the person who's considered basically the last of the Dutch radicals is Van Insinga, who died maybe in the 30s or 40s. And so he was kind of the last one, up until the resurgence of Dutch radicalism as espoused by Darrell Doty, now Hermann Detering, and Robert Price. And I hope I did justice to the chronology.
Okay. What do we mean by inauthenticity of the Paulines? Just that it couldn't be by the same Paul described in Acts, or does it mean something different and deeper?
I think it's both. It's two things. It's the fact that it couldn't have been one person writing all of that because of all the stylistic and language differences and scenes and interpolations and all that stuff, but also that none of it dates back to the 50s and 60s, and so therefore the radical conclusion from all this really is that we have no primary sources concerning Christian origins.
Okay. So is the idea that they're not authentic that the character of Paul represented in his own epistles appears contrived? Is that what they're trying to say? That the epistles weren't really epistles and that they're made to look like epistles even though they aren't?
To some degree, that's part of their argument, yeah. I think I'm pretty safe in saying that, yeah.
And if they're saying it's not by one author because of the stylistic differences, how many authors are they positing? I mean, 2 or 3 or 13 different authors. I mean,
that's a really good question and goes to the heart of the question that was raised last week about the half brief, F.C. Bauer's half brief, which was Galatians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. Some people, like Reuven, for instance, believes that they were written by the same person. And that it spurred a conversation further on in Facebook about, I was thinking about, I've been doing a lot of reading about Bayesian statistical method lately, and there was an episode where we were trying to determine, we took all of the Federalist Papers, the famous founding of the nation, the Federalist Papers, who we know were written by Hamilton, Madison, and a gentleman named John Jay. Now, using these Bayesian analysis of these texts, we were able to tell who wrote what with some pretty high degree of accuracy. I think we should conduct a similar kind of a Bayesian analysis of the Pauline texts, like we did for the documentary hypotheses, to see how many different people and/or quote-unquote schools are behind this. I think that would be a worthwhile thing for an up-and-coming scholar. Are you listening, Daniel? To do.
Yeah. So under the hypothesis, just temporarily, I'm not saying anybody in particular follows this. Under the hypothesis that what you call it, the Hoffs, I can't pronounce that word. I haven't learned that word yet. So the 4 epistles were written by one person, and then the other nine were written by someone else.
Or synonymous.
Then a third person went through and redacted all of them.
Yeah, no, but I think I don't know. I think this is why I would really love to see a statistical analysis of the language itself, because let's say that the 4 big epistles were by the same person. The other ones, the other 3, and then the other 3 beyond that, the pastorals obviously are just by whoever.
So I meant other 6. Yeah, I meant other 6, not 9.
Yeah, but I think I don't think we can answer that. In other words, right now, I think we need to do that kind of an analysis on the texts.
In other words, my jumping off point right now is that I do believe there's an original version of the 10 letters ascribed to Paul, and all 10 of those have. I'm not sure about Philemon actually, but at least 9 of those 10 have Catholic interpolations in them, extensive interpolations.
Yes.
Which create the difference between the Marcionite and Catholic versions.
Right, and I think it's important.
But if in the pre-interpolated version, 4 of those are by one author and 6 are by another, that would give us 3 authors total. It would give us an author of the 4, an author of the 6, and then the reactor of all. And I'm assuming that the pastorals are written by the same person as the redactor, but that's also a conjecture.
Yeah, I think I would be okay with positing that the pastorals are written by possibly the redactor, whether it's Polycarp or not, I can't really say. But I don't have a reason for thinking that the 6 revolving around the 4 main ones were written by the same person. I think that probably several hands were involved in those 6.
Okay, so we might have 5 or 6 authors then,
or who knows? Yeah, who knows how many? And that's, you see what I'm saying? It's like we need to come up with a new documentary hypothesis to delineate which one is this. Is it P or E or J?
Gotcha. Yeah, that would be an interesting endeavor.
Yeah.
I think as a working hypothesis, though, I think it's simpler to think in terms of at most 3 authors here. And probably just 2, just original and redacted, but maybe the reason's not.
I'd be okay with 3 stages. I'd say 3 stages instead of 3 authors. Yeah.
Okay. But anyway, we're outside of what Detering was talking about here.
Oh yeah, well, we left it off on. I was describing the Dutch radical school and kind of what their basic arguments were. So where should we take this then?
I'm trying to find the next section here. Going through.
Well, this is where he goes. He goes and finds the Antiqua. He goes to the Netherlands and goes and finds the Edwin Johnson book. Reuven, thank you. Yeah, whatever. So he goes to the library, and he finds this book, which is kind of like a holy grail to him, which I thought was kind of really weird. He sounded kind of like a fanboy in this section.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because once he finally finds the book, he comes up with a nice synopsis of what the book reads, and it's kind of anticlimactic, as I see it.
So, okay, starting on page 54 of this PDF, Detering starts listing some passages in the epistles that.
Yeah, hold on. I'm gonna open up the PDF because I have my Kindle open. Okay.
Page 56, including the cover page, but it's numbered 54.
Okay. Hold on, I'm opening it. Page what?
If you do a jump to page 56, and then the top left corner should say 54.
Okay, I'm almost there. All right, cool.
But Detering is listing verses in Paul's epistles that make it look like things like a real Paul wouldn't really write.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah.
Where it's a really elaborate introduction or self-description.
Yeah, like Paul called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God. That sounds more like something somebody would say about Paul than something he would say himself.
Right.
You know, Paul, slave of Jesus Christ, called to be apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. I mean, these epistles start with these things where it's almost like somebody's trying to tell the reader that, hey, you should take this as important.
Yeah, you should listen
by this important person.
This is, after all, from Paul, so you should really pay attention. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, did you have a thought about that? Because you agree that this is problematic, or?
Yeah, I do think it seems suspicious. I mean, I don't think it's a silver bullet or anything. It's not a knockdown argument, but it's suspicious. It's substantial evidence against these things being written by a.
Well, especially when you could contrast it to when we look at the literature from the period.
Yeah.
Look at the Greek literature. It's usually something like, your servant Flavius from Rome, and that's basically the whole introduction. He doesn't devote. People don't usually devote so much time to prove their credentials.
Yeah.
In their letters.
I haven't checked in, like Jason Badun or others, whether these, what would you call them? My brain's not thinking right. Anyway, these statements about Paul, these pretentious statements about
pretentious
Paul.
And vainglorious statements, yes.
Yeah. Are they in the Marcionite version, according to?
Well, that's what I was kind of hoping you would look up.
Yeah, I was going to do that now. Some of these, which one should I look up? Let's try 1 Corinthians 1:1, I guess, might be one to look up.
Which one is it?
I'm looking at 1 Corinthians 1:1.
Okay.
Badun has some of it bracketed and some of it missing, but yeah, I'd have to read Badun's footnote to know what's going on. He has Paul, then in brackets called to be, and then an emissary of Jesus Christ, and then in brackets through God's will, and then there's an omission, and then to the assembly of God that is in Corinth. ending in brackets. And then may you have favor and peace from God our Father and Master Jesus.
Right.
So that doesn't really tell me much there. What's another good one? What was the first one here? I don't see the. I'm not seeing where Detering's quoting from on some of these.
Actually, the one in Galatians 1:11, it says, "I want you to know." That's an interesting one to me.
Galatians 1:11. Okay.
Had Paul left the Galatians, like he goes, "I want you to know." He doesn't say what somebody would have said in that case. Would have been something more like, "As you know, the gospel preached by me was not of men." Instead of saying, "I want you to know."
Yeah.
In other words, is he teaching this to them for the first time now? Do they not know this?
Yeah.
And also to the churches of Galatia, which is problematic in itself.
Okay, you said Galatians 1:11?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just kind of looking at them as I go here now too.
Badun brackets that one also, and I want to clarify for people listening here: when Badun brackets stuff, it's things that he doesn't find clear testimony in the Church Fathers of whether it's in Marcion or not. But he assumes it must be because of context. So
it must be in the original?
Yeah, but that's just Badun's conjecture.
Right, yeah.
Stuff. He conjectures it's there.
Well, this is important though, because if it is there, it's important. And if it's not there, then it's inconsequential.
But Galatians 1:11 is something that Badun has just bracketed. So Badun believes it was there, but he doesn't have the citation to confirm it.
Okay, then let's look. If we find one where he definitely knows is there, then Detering is kind of vindicated a little bit, or at least
give me another one.
Let me see.
Well, I'm just curious how early, if these could have actually been earlier documents that these pompous statements were interpolated into early on.
Right.
Before the other interpolations. I mean, these could have been interpolated prior to the Marcionite versions.
Yeah, so nothing is written in stone, but I hear what you're saying.
Is there another one to look up?
Well, I'm looking at some of the further ones. Why is the corresponding reference in Galatians not so regarded? And he goes into 1 Corinthians 3:1.
1 Corinthians 3:1. I'll look for that. This is kind of takes me a while to look these up because the order of the letters in Badun is not the same as I'm used to in the Catholic Bible. So I gotta go back and through the pages to find the correct letter. 1 Corinthians 3:1. Did you say?
Yeah.
Omission, but I gotta check his notes to see if it's unattested or if it's an actual. So I gotta go to the. I wish the notes were in the same page, but they're not. Now I forget where it's at.
That's cool.
1 Corinthians 3:1. Okay. Should have did this not live on some of this stuff because it takes me a long time to flip pages on here. 1 Corinthians 3:1-9 is unattested. Harnack accepts with reservation verses 2-4 on the basis of Adamantius 5:22, but this quotation falls before Adamantius takes quotations from the Apostolicon. Adamantius 1:9 likewise quotes verses 2-3a, but may not be employing the Apostolicon either.
Can you look up Romans 1:1? Paul set apart for the gospel of God, namely.
Yeah.
We'll make that the last one because what's important here, I think, for anybody who's listening, is
that's bracketed. That's Badun brackets that one.
Okay. Because what's important, I think, in this for people who are listening is that if it's not included in the original, at least Badun's is his own reconstruction. That's you have to take that into consideration. But if it's not included in the original, then it was probably an interpolation that was a Catholic interpolation.
Yeah.
And if it is included, but we don't have anything that Beydoun thinks is rock solid was part of the original so far.
Yeah. Or that he can confirm his absence. They're all bracketed. There's
Right,
nothing,
yeah.
we don't have a confirmed presence in Marcion or a confirmed absence from Marcion of any of these.
Okay. So what do you think, given that this is...
I think this is another question we'll just have to table for later of how early those...
Okay. But I think that's what's important is if they are part of the earlier Paulines, then it means that what Marcion had these vainglorious, pompous statements in it.
Yeah.
But if they're not there, then they're just Catholic interpolations that we can't really use them as evidence.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of just browsed through some of that, and now I'm at the bottom of page 57. I don't know what I'm going to use this page or not. I'm just skip ahead. Tell me if you see anything you want to comment on.
57? Hold on. Okay.
I'm going ahead. I didn't highlight anything here. Okay, he talks about a silence in Josephus regarding the historical Paul and other authors. I mean, is it likely that non-Christian authors would have mentioned Paul if he'd really existed? I heard that kind of argument for Jesus. There's no reliable testimony outside Christian sources for the historical Jesus. Like Josephus is almost certainly an interpolation, and some of the other ones, like Tacitus, say too little or are interpolations. But can we say the same thing about Paul? Would Paul have been significant enough for them to even talk about?
Well, I think that Detering, I need to be careful here because I think Detering thinks that this leads him to believe that Paul was also an invention.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I go that far, or at least I'm kind of weighing that. The fact that Paul is not attributed anywhere in the textual record until Marcion is kind of an interesting flag to me, though. I don't think that Marcion wrote them, though. I think I'm contra Detering on that point, for the same reasoning, more or less, that you give, that there are discontinuities between what Marcion had, the thought of Marcion, and what Paul actually wrote. There are too many of those for Marcion to have written it himself. And so I don't think Marcion wrote them.
Yeah. Like I said, I don't really have a formed argument for this view, but just the working hypothesis in my mind that I'm kind of using as a reference point in my head, even though I need to build a theory around it, is that I think that Paul was a real person writing maybe the very late 1st century, like maybe the 80s or 90s. But or maybe 70s or 100s or something. But I mean, anytime, late 1st century, very early 2nd is where I would place it. I think trying to place him in the 50s and 60s is probably too early. But I think trying to place them, in the mid-2nd century is way too late. I think these writings are established, in the.
By the time Marcion is a young man, yes.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
I'm not against the idea of Paul being a real person who lived just maybe a generation before Marcion, 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, but the problem, though, is that it raises the question: is where were these texts before Marcion got a hold of them, and why were they held so important that even Tertullian would claim them for himself? That's a mystery. That's a $64,000 question.
Yeah. That I don't know.
And that's, I think it's kind of important that also that Marcion has these writings. Justin has never heard of them, apparently.
Yeah.
That's weird.
Yeah. It could have just been some just oddball Jewish Christian writer, Well, depends whether you think the original Paul was Jewish. Maybe, probably not. Probably just a Gentile Christian then, because there's a lot of arguments. Detering makes he's probably correct that Paul doesn't really seem Jewish. But
Yeah,
probably just some fringe Christian writer of the late 2nd century or something that the Marcionites just happened to like, and they popularized him, and it became popular with everybody through that.
right. But why was his historic significance transposed back to the 50s? Is it just to get him as close to Jesus as possible?
I would think so, possibly.
I mean,
I haven't really thought about the question, though. I haven't really thought about the question. I'm not saying that I see evidence that it needs to be late 1st century, but I'm saying, though, that I'm comfortable putting it at that time. I mean, if it's early or mid 1st century, I'm fine with that too. And since I don't believe in a historical Jesus, I'd even be willing to put it in the 1st century BCE.
Right.
Theoretically. I mean, I don't think it's out of the question.
Yeah, I follow you on that. But the problem though is we don't have warrant to do so. The only way we can put it in the 50s is if we come up with an argument based on Acts.
Yeah.
And we can't do that because Acts is Acts.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything from the letters themselves, if you take them just on their own without the interpolations and apart from Acts, that's useful for dating them. I'm not really aware of any arguments from that from that angle.
Right.
I may need to read Badun's reconstruction of the Apostolicon and see if anything in that strikes me as being tied to a certain time period or not. But I don't think there will be. I think it's also general in the theology and stuff that with no contemporary references that I don't think it's possible to date it. I think it's in a sense timeless the way it's written.
I agree, and I think I'm with you on the point that it's probably late 1st, early 2nd at the latest.
Yeah.
Turn of the century stuff, and the reason for that is just because no one seems to have heard it until Marcion. That's problematic to me. And if the most famous Christian of his day, that is Justin, has never heard of these writings, that's just too weird for me. I'm going to say that again.
Yeah.
And so
there actually is a reason, though, I would think that maybe 70 AD is probably the earliest it's written. It's just I think Christianity in general is a response to the destruction in Jerusalem. And I don't think it really existed in any recognizable sense before that. But that's a whole different issue.
But this brings me to this kind of Paul mythicism. If Paul was somebody who was around in the 70s writing, in the 80s and 90s perhaps, then basically the idea of Paul that we think we have it's kind of just an oasis. It's kind of like the idea of Jesus that we have. If we have no evidence for Jesus, then even if there was such a person as Jesus, we have no way of knowing who it was.
Yeah. But I need to rethink this whole thing now. I need to list the different hypotheses, who Paul might be, and then go through all the evidence, and mark, which columns it supports, one column for each hypothesis, and see what I end up with.
So I mean, I don't at this point I'm gonna.
Yeah. We need to get back to Detering though here, but yeah, but.
Yeah, but I think I'm going to say that the whole chapter, this chapter of Detering, is kind of problematic for me because he's trying to assert that, one, Paul is not historic, and second of all, at the end of the chapter, he asserts that Marcion, in fact, is either a student of Marcion or Marcion himself is the author of the Pauline epistles. And I think that the case that he makes is really weak.
Yeah, but I'm thinking we might be able to find middle ground here, though. That's the thing. I need to think through it more, but I think some of Detering's arguments are decent arguments. I think
yes.
A lot of what he talks about and things, not being plausible,
The one that he closes the chapter with has to do he seems to think that the exclusivity shown in one of the epistles, I forget which one he was pointing to, he translated as, by that point in history, there was excommunication going on, like the kind that happened in 144 for Marcion.
Yes.
And I think that that's a plausible reading of the verse he's talking about, but I don't think it's necessarily so.
Gotcha.
I don't think that necessarily it means excommunication. And that particular one, I think, is a weak argument. It's plausible, but it's a weak argument in my opinion.
But anyway, Detering talks about lots of different things in this chapter. I mean, so I wouldn't reject, I wouldn't just reject the whole chapter. Like he talks about the two Pauls on page 61. And this is actually widely accepted in scholarship. I mean, the Acts Seminar recognizes this, that there's, that the Paul described in the epistles is in several ways very different from the Paul described in the book of Acts.
Yeah, but I think
these two Pauls are pretty much irreconcilable.
Right. I think that is a fact. Yes, I think that is true. But I think that Detering is talking about two Pauls in the Paulines, no?
That's not what I got. I thought he was comparing the Paulines with Acts in this section.
Because I think early on in the book he had already established that the Acts is useless for determining anything about Paul.
He may have started talking about that, but I think he's just returning to the issue here at this point and talking about it more, and you're getting more details on why there's a conflict between Acts and the Pauline epistles.
Yeah, because I think that's kind of indubitable. I think that, the Paul in Acts is not the same as the Paul in the epistles.
Can you give some examples just for listeners?
Yeah, I think we went into it last week to some degree.
Okay.
The Paul who in Acts is somebody who is yearning to be included into the circle of the 12 theologically and liturgically. He wants, the 12 are the important thing, and Paul is merely trying to gain acceptance from them. Whereas in the epistles, he's very, very biting in his criticism of Peter and of James, the James gang. He's not so much, he's insisting that he's their equal as opposed to yearning for their acceptance in Acts. You follow me? He's a lot more insolent in the epistles, and in Acts he's very servile.
Gotcha, yeah. I was trying to read ahead in Detering a little bit. I mean, skim the chapter again in Detering to figure what to talk about next. So I was focusing on Detering while you were talking to the listeners. So.
But nevertheless,
I could buy some time.
Yeah, but the main difference between Paul in Acts and Paul in the epistles is that, for me, there are, we can go into details, like, for instance, Paul says that he got the gospel from no man in Galatians, but in Acts, he gets blinded on the road to Damascus, and then he's tutored by Ananias, and then taken to Jerusalem, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So that's a contradiction right there, for instance.
An interesting point here is it seems to make Paul the originator of the gospel, or the original recipient of the message, almost the same way that Muhammad is for Islam. He's the prophet of Islam.
Carrier thinks that.
This is in a way making Paul the originator of this Christianity, not part of not part of an earlier tradition. Does that actually seem to follow, or does there actually seem to be he talks about people who were apostles before him. Is that just make-believe, or is he really trying to fit into some other context there? And what were the apostles before him teaching then?
Well, that's a good question. But I think if he posits that...
And I think when he's talking about apostles before him, he's just talking about other Christians in a very general sense. I don't think he has the gospel, disciples in mind at all.
Well,
I think he's just talking about other just other, missionaries, basically.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I don't think we can. I don't think we can derive the whole 12,
Yeah.
you know, mythology from the epistles.
But I
But
think there's things in Paul that, but I think there's things in Paul that some of them make it seem like he's the originator of his view. You know, he didn't get it from anybody else. But there's other parts where he's talking about people who are already Christians before him.
right,
And I don't
I
see
agree.
how those are reconcilable. Something seems to be oddball about those juxtaposed with each other.
Well, of course, unless Jesus is a spirit being that communicates to all the apostles the same way, which is by visions.
Uh,
In which case, if it's positing that Paul is the originator of the gospel of the kerygma, let's say, uh, then that's a problem because Detering also happens to think that Marcion is the author of Paul, which would make Marcion the inventor of the kerygma, which is
yeah.
really weird.
Yeah. The other question I want to throw in here, just as an aside, is how much evidence do we have for other Christianities at this time already? I mean, if these things are starting out at Marcion's time, does that give enough time for the other Gnostic groups to arise? Does it give time for some of the other Jewish Christian groups to arise? I mean, the conflicts between Jewish and Gentile Christianity seem to have a longer history before this.
Yeah, that's a good point.
The Ebionites, that's what I'm trying to think of. Yeah, does
Yeah.
it give time does it give a plausible origin for them in this theory?
Yeah, and I think Carrier argued that he seems to think that there's evidence for thinking that Paul is the originator of the kerygma. But the problem I have with that is if the I'm just for the sake of argument, if I accept that the four letters go back to one author and are authentic, then Romans seems to not. He seems to be a complete newcomer to an already existing church in Rome, and so that argument doesn't hold. But then again, we have to try. It's all these different theories that we have to fit it all on.
Yeah. One thing that Detering says that I'm really skeptical of, but I want to follow more of what he means by it and how he elaborates on it. And this is at the bottom of page. I'm zoomed in, so I got to scroll to see the page number. Page 65.
Page
Um,
65. Hold on.
As we have seen, by closer observation, it becomes clear that Acts and Galatians are in conversation with one another, that in their work the authors of both writings have each other clearly in view.
Right.
I'm just not sure I buy it as being two ways. I can get Acts being, a polemic that downplays, knows about, but downplays the letters. But I don't. I'm just not buying the thesis that the letters know Acts, or that the letters are in conversation with Acts. That seems
Well,
highly suspicious to me.
right, and I think his reasoning, if I remember correctly, has to do with the polemical tone of Galatians. That Galatians seems to be refuting that which Acts is trying to defend about Paul. But it needs to be examined. Actually, will you give me a couple of minutes? I have to
Sure.
sign off for a second here.
Yeah, I need a minute also. So
Okay, I'll be back in a minute.
yeah. Okay, I'm back, and I have to kind of apologize to the listeners here. I'm kind of sleep deprived right now, so I'm not. My brain is a little hazy, and I'm not really thinking clearly. But I'm trying to do my best to follow this. And I'm also. This is my first time going through Detering's argument, and I haven't read the other Dutch radicals that much. I read a little bit of Couchot, who was a French writer, but I really haven't. I really don't have much prior experience in this particular line of argument, and I only have Leon to bounce off of right now. So the Hangout's kind of a little bit more awkward than it usually is. But apologies for that. But we'll do our best here.
Okay, I'm back.
Is Dale still here, just out of curiosity?
No, I think he fell asleep or he walked away. Dale? Or Reuven?
I'm here, but I was lying down listening, and I did fall asleep a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was gonna say, a question for Dale and for Reuven is: are we kind of making sense of the book for you? Is this making any sense what we're talking about?
Yeah, what I've heard does make sense.
Okay.
Makes me sorry I didn't read it.
Yeah, we've
Okay.
gone on some tangents a bit. I don't think we've done the best job of actually describing Detering's argument and what Dettering's saying. I think we've spin off on our own thoughts most of the time here. So.
Well, I've tried to describe what Detering is saying. He's, the gist of the chapter though is Marcion wrote at the end of the chapter. He comes to the conclusion that Marcion wrote the Pauline epistles. He has a lot of arguments for, not necessarily good arguments for that, but he does, like Wayne pointed out, he does make good arguments that are preliminary to that regarding the whether the Pauline epistles show later tradition or later tendencies.
Yeah.
Does he believe that for the 10 Pauline letters that were part of Marcion's canon?
Yeah, I think he buys into the Dutch radical conclusions completely. I think he doesn't find any of the Paulines authentic, and like I said, he thinks that Marcion wrote them, which I don't agree with him on. Neither does Wayne.
Yeah, I need more evidence of his assertion. It is unthinkable that one piece of the puzzle, Galatians, is many decades older than the other, and that the implicit polemic of Acts was conserved over many decades in order to appear again in a time in which the debate about the apostleship of Paul after his death had long since become insignificant. On the other hand, it is difficult to imagine that the writer of Galatians did not know Acts, or one of its predecessors, which, last but not least, is indicated by the highly polemical tendency that present-day scholars call attention to. Yeah, I need to see Detering argue that better. I'm just not buying it.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
And I even think that even if Galatians was written, many decades before Acts could be motivated by Marcionites making Galatians popular, and more popular than it had been for a long time. So it could have been an unpopular writing for decades, plausibly, and as soon as the Marcionite churches became, very dominant in the empire, something had to be done about the books, the writings that they're using.
This will be a good segue to talk about how he introduces the possibility that, quote unquote, there's a passage in Tertullian that says that Marcion, quote unquote, discovered the book of Galatians. And he kind of makes a big deal about the semantic meaning of discovered in that instance.
Yeah, I'm not a Tertullian scholar, and I remember reading that in Detering, but I didn't get a chance to research it. So what's
Yeah.
your opinion on that? Did you buy that argument?
No, because of the fact that it seems to me Tertullian seems to accept that Galatians is Pauline and is Catholic. You know what I'm saying? If
Yeah.
Marcion would have just discovered it, I think that was just a slip of the tongue.
Yeah.
He used wording that was inadequate. Tertullian used wording that was not quite right.
Yeah. Now, page 67 of this PDF, he talks about some stuff about Paul that seems fantastical. Um, like I'll read, or for example, the writer's incidental remarks that he had fought with wild animals in Ephesus, that after many other hardships, 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1, 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, he was adrift on the sea for a day and a night,
Right.
literally on the bottom of the sea, that he was received by the churches in Galatia as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. Why? I
So
mean, do these make sense as in a historical context, or are these the kind of things you find in fictional writings?
yeah, I kind of agree with him on this. I think that I don't think that even if there were a person of Paul, I think he's showing way too many scars. And how does somebody survive a stoning?
Yeah, that's the good point. I mean, it's almost like it's a story about Stephen, which Stephen, is mentioned in Acts, but never really mentioned again. And the role of the first martyr in Christian history is actually seems to be possessed more by James than by Stephen, even though Acts places Stephen as the first martyr. But this, comment about Paul of him being stoned almost makes him sound like he's taking the place of Stephen.
Yeah, it's way too much, way too heroic. I think this is
Yeah,
all make believe,
yeah.
hyperbole.
I'm still wondering if there's some kind of connection intended there, though. If the Stephen story is derivative from this, but no, it wasn't Paul, it was somebody else.
It's
That the writer of Acts is trying to say
it's
in response to this
plausible.
passage.
It's plausible, and I think we've already demonstrated that things that made it to a canonical level, writings that made it to a canonical level, they have a tendency of repeating themselves at each other.
Yeah, because this is actually a really interesting, contrast between Corinthians and Acts. That that in Acts, Paul's watching Stephen getting stoned, and here in Corinthians, Paul is saying that himself was stoned.
Right.
I never knew about that before. I never noticed this verse in Corinthians before. It's fascinating.
I really want to know how the hell does one survive a stoning?
Yeah, I know. If he did, and why wouldn't there be more mention of it?
Right.
If it's supposedly a miracle, like why is it only mentioned in passing?
I think that's a real problem.
Yeah, a real problem for what though? I mean, it's definitely a problem for for the very traditional view, that Paul was written in the 50s about a real person and stuff. But is it a problem for for Dettering's view? Is it a problem for other hybrid views? I mean,
Well, it's not a problem for Dettering's view because Detering is trying to show that Paul's fictional, and so
yeah,
that's not a problem at all.
yeah,
If these are all heroic make believe acts, that plays right into
yeah,
Detering. But it's a problem for the traditional view for sure
yeah,
because it means that these writings are not really by
yeah.
any real tangible person.
Yeah, but is it a problem for the view that that Paul was a real person, just not the person described by Acts? Maybe a person writing in the 90s or something. I mean, would this be evidence against that?
I'm going to read what Reuven said. Reuven said, if stoning refers to being thrown off a high place and then pelted with rocks, only if you survive the fall then you could play dead upon hitting the ground and survive that way. Yeah, it's plausible, but I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm speculating so much here. That I mean, this the entire subject matter we're talking about has a lot of, how would I say it, difficult evidence and fragmentary evidence. So it's really hard to really construct what's really happening here. So and a lot of cases the best we have is conjecture.
I will say that Detering is, there's a lot of speculation going on, but Detering is not any worse at that than, say, someone like Barker is.
Yeah.
The only difference between Detering and Barker is Barker just threw, citation of verse after citation of verse after citation of verse until you had to run for cover, whereas Detering does just the opposite. He gives you a couple of examples here and there, and then he moves on to his next point. So that's an interesting contrast between these two.
Yeah. Why does Acts of the Apostles remain silent about the letters of Paul? I mean,
that's a good.
We're taking it. We're presuming that the Acts knows the epistles, and there's so many connections that seems almost to be fairly certain that Acts is aware of the epistles. Yet it never explicitly says that Paul wrote letters. It never it never says these churches had letters from Paul. So that.
And yet Acts is trying to make some kind of logical model of Paul's travels.
Yeah.
Because, I think it's very arguable that Acts knew the letters, but that's really a mystery. That's a really, really good question. It's why isn't Paul a letter writer in Acts?
So, reading through the different possible explanations Detering lists, the first is that Luke knew the Pauline writings, but for certain reasons would not or could not mention them. And I believe that's the way approach the Acts seminar takes. Is
right,
that
because
he didn't want to basically give credence to the letters in a way.
But it makes no sense though, because why is Paul such a hero if it thinks that Paul is the apostle to the heretics, and this is what the letters are saying, then why make Paul into a hero at all?
Yeah, there's more mysteries than answers here in my mind. Option 2, Luke did not know the Pauline writings, even though they already existed. I think there's too many connections between Acts and the epistle and the Pauline epistles to choose that option. Luke did not know the Pauline writings because in his time no literature at all in the name of Paul yet existed. And that's the third option.
And I believe the fourth one was the most ridiculous one.
I forget where the fourth one is here.
Hold on. Did not know the Pauline writings.
It must be.
It was in another section. Sorry. Yeah.
Are you guys willing to consider the idea that that there was a very influential Paul that really did exist, and he was a church planter, all right? He planted a series of churches and had an influence on their theology, all right? But he never wrote any letters. And now both communities, Marcion's community and the Orthodox community, the proto-Catholic community, wants to co-opt him, and so they both write letters in his name and claim him as their father. Are you open to that idea, and does that have problems?
That does make sense to me, but the only problem though is that still Acts doesn't. The author Luke, whoever that might be, doesn't seem to know of letters, and so Paul might have been a famous preacher, yes, but I think the letters. And
that's what I'm suggesting that's what I'm suggesting in this scenario is that Paul never wrote any letters. That explains why Luke doesn't know of any letters, and it's only the later churches, both churches, that want to claim him, and they feel the need to write letters in his name.
I think what you're saying makes the most sense to me too, kind of, which makes Paul into a kind of long lost, forgotten memory, kind of like Jesus was.
Yeah.
In other words, we don't know who Paul was.
Yeah. I have a little bit of an issue with how Detering writes in this particular part of this chapter. He's making this list of reasons why Acts doesn't mention the letters, but he interrupts himself with talking about the fact that the book of Revelation doesn't mention Paul writing letters. He has this little bit of an excursion in here in the middle of his list.
Right.
But do you think it's significant that the book of Revelation writes to some of the same churches but never mentions Paul?
In the sense that the symbolism in Revelation seems to be about, opening the seal, which kind of suggests letters.
Yeah.
And so it raises the question in my mind, are the epistles of Paul somehow related to this letter imagery that Revelation is bringing up?
Yeah. But I'm more willing to go with the view that Revelation's written about 70 A.D. and that the letters of Paul are after that, later, 80s or 90s. So.
Right. No, I agree, but I think,
yeah.
Yeah, but it goes hand in hand with what I'm saying, though, is might the letters be an emulation of Revelation's idea of letters?
Oh, possibly, yeah. Possibly.
You dig what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I'm just brainstorming.
Yeah.
So.
And then Detering's talking about Justin Martyr here, and having not yet heard of Paul. What's his argument in here? He talks about places where Justin's talking about some of the same ideas Paul talks about, but doesn't mention Paul. Like when he's talking about the possibility of resurrection, he uses a similar analogy to Paul, but he doesn't connect it with 1 Corinthians 15.
Right, so I think some of the theological ideas that Justin was playing around with were in the air. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the same mother lode that the author of, if it's the same author, the 4 main epistles, is mining from.
Yeah. So Detering asks, how can we explain the strange fact that Justin speaks in Pauline phrases without ever mentioning Paul or his letters? So I think you already answered that, but yeah.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about, exactly what we're talking about. It might have been the same mother lode that both people were sucking from.
Yeah.
Or I should say gleaning from, or whatever. Feeding from. But I think it's problematic. The fact Justin and Acts are both a problem for the idea that there are such things as real Pauline letters that date back to the early or mid 1st century.
Yeah. Bottom of page 72 is when Detering resumes talking about. No, he's not. I'm sorry, I misread this. He's still talking about Justin here. So this is okay. He's not. As an explanation of why Justin does not mention the Pauline letters, he gives 5 different explanations. Okay, I misread this when I read this before.
Yeah,
I think he was talking about Luke Acts still, but he wasn't.
But yeah, the reasoning there is because Justin saw Paul as the apostle of the heretics.
Yeah.
Which kind of makes sense.
So he lists that one can deny that the passages that sound like Paul should be traced back to the Pauline writings, or that Justin knew any Pauline tradition. One can assume that Justin did indeed know Paul, but deliberately ignored him because he was the primary witness for Marcion, the heretic whom Justin fought. One can presume that Justin refrained from mentioning Paul out of respect for his Jewish dialogue partner. I'm not sure I really get where he's going with that one.
Yeah.
One can disregard what is found in the text and make Justin an ardent follower of Paul.
In which, that's just nonsense, I think.
Yeah. But he refers to some scholars who have tried doing that, and he explains why he didn't buy that.
Yeah, and I think he's right on that, or at least on that little bit. Yeah.
In view that in view of the fact that Justin does not explicitly mention the Pauline letters, one could surmise that they did not yet exist, or that they were not yet circulating as letters of Paul. To
Which
begin
makes
with,
sense.
there could have been only general theological tracts, which, having originated in heretical Marcionite circles, were already by and large identical with later Pauline letters, but did not yet sail under the flag of the apostle.
So if the Pauline corpus was made into a collection for the first time in Marcionite circles, that would make sense.
Yeah. So it's possibly, I mean, is it possible that Marcion's version did not have them as letters, or were they definitely letters at that time?
I think that by the time of Marcion, there already had to have been a collection.
Okay. Oh, not a collection, but I mean in the form of letters, not just general treatises. You think the addresses to the individual churches were already part of the text at that time?
Right, except why would they be turned into letters, though? Gosh, This is so weird.
Yeah.
Because I already think they were treatises. I after last week's conversation about Ephesians, I actually I read Ephesians, and it seems to me that I think he's right about there being no clear sits and leaving in Ephesians. And if it is a treatise, why turn it into a letter? What was so important about them being letters? And this might have, like I said just a few moments ago, maybe the person needs them to be letters because he needs revelation to be vindicated somehow.
Or
I don't know.
Or maybe he wants them to be letters sent around so they can claim that the other churches, outside Marcion's influence, had copies of some of them.
And that it's a centralized thing.
Yeah.
That it's not just every church for himself.
Yeah. He talks about First Clement and Ignatius as he talks about them both being forgeries.
Yeah, I'm with him on that.
Is that the right word to use?
Yeah, I think so.
Can you tell us a little bit about what these books contain, or what these letters contain, and what their significance is, and why it matters whether they're forgeries or not?
Starting with First Clement, we have to take them individually. First Clement is usually forwarded as the first mention of Paul. Yeah, it's far too long to be an epistle. That's one argument. It's 60 chapters of this really tedious pastoral kind of vision of the church. And that goes against, in my opinion, that's just not feasible. But moreover, usually the only datum that's usually forwarded to support an early date, 90s date for Clement, is in the introduction. He says something along the lines of, we've been held up by all these difficulties and these tribulations, which people usually say, you see, that points to Neronian persecution. And I don't think that's a tenable argument. I think that's just a general letter introduction going, oh, sorry I haven't written, but I've been really busy. That's all that's saying. If you follow me.
Yeah.
It's just a general form, a formal, trope, let's call it, of saying, oops, sorry I've been busy and I haven't been able to write. And if you take that away, then we can't really date Clement at all.
Gotcha. Yeah, Reuven mentions that even John Calvin thought all the Ignatian epistles were forgeries.
The Ignatian epistles, yeah.
We have over a dozen epistles of Ignatius, and the majority of scholars accept a few as authentic on roughly the same grounds as the authentic 7 of Paul.
I think for me, the person that finally convinced me of that the Ignatian letters are forged was Peter Kirby. Actually, there's a great piece in the Journal of Higher Criticism where he lays out a really good case for them being forgeries. And Detering hints at a lot of the same reasons, and also at the fact that the middle recension, the shorter recension of the Ignatian letters contains only 7. I think it's an interesting parallel there where we're trying to revive. We try to keep this number 7 intact, and I think it's as spurious in the Ignatian epistles as it is ultimately for the Pauline.
Gotcha.
But the number 7 has a lot to do with it trying to keep that number alive. Like that 7 is the number of completion in the Judaism of the day.
Yeah, Detering seems to be saying that the Sitsem. Oh, actually, talking about Ignatian now, but that the Sitsem Levin for the Ignatian epistles just doesn't really make sense. That the conflict in the church of in Corinth that it's writing, supposedly writing to, isn't. Can you explain what's wrong about that?
Oh, there's so many things. Like what's wrong with Ignatius being real? I mean, basically the Sitsem Levin, like you said. Wait, Reuben? There you go. Thank you. The Sitsem Levin, in other words, here's this guy who's supposed to be in chains, traveling toward Rome, and he's writing these treatises on how we should obey our elders and our bishops and all these things. It just doesn't seem like it's a real scenario. And he's saying, all you people who want to save me from the beast, no, don't do that. I want to be fed to the beasts. It's just a really, really weird, almost masochistic of Ignatius. I agree with Detering. And with Peter Kirby. I don't think they reveal a real scenario.
And Detering spends a lot of time talking about Clement and Ignatius. That ends his first chapter, talking about why he believes those are not authentic. But now, if they're not written when they're supposed to be written, how late could they have been written? I mean, are they 3rd century works or late 2nd?
I don't know, but if we posit the existence of the Bishop Ignatius to the year 110, and somebody's trying to use him as an example, and it's not a realistic example, at least it makes, I think, the terminus of the letter, at least at the time of Ignatius or later. Do you follow me? In other words, if I'm claiming that it's from Ignatius, but it's not, it's at least later than Ignatius.
Yeah.
Which means that the earliest it could be is 110. At the earliest, it's 110, but it must be.
That's what the latest it could be, is what I was asking.
I don't know, but the fact that it's bringing up themes that are very ecclesiastical / pastoral puts them in the same range at the earliest as the pastorals.
It's like late 2nd century then, mid to late 2nd.
Mid to late 2nd century, yeah. And the fact that they're trying to prove, the fact that it's the Clement and Ignatius are the first citations of Paul, and they date back to after Justin. You dig?
Yeah.
And so there's not really much. There's not really much there to cite or to attest to the existence of a Paul or the letters of a Paul.
Yeah. Detering spends quite a few pages talking about doubt, talking about Descartes. It says cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, and
yeah, I thought that was a little bit superfluous, but I guess I kind of see why he did, but I think it's superfluous.
Yeah. And just my own little excursion here, I'm probably on the fringe among students of philosophy, but I believe Descartes was wrong. I believe cogito ergo sum is a non sequitur. almost everybody believes that Descartes was right. That I think therefore I am, and is logically valid. I do not think so. I think there's actual counterexamples to that.
Counterexample. I'm sorry, I was reading the right-hand block that Reuven. Can you repeat that last part?
To Descartes, I think therefore I am. I think we have to imagine fictional characters as having defined properties. And thinking has to be one of those defined properties we can allow fictional characters to have.
Of course, yeah.
But he's thinking, Wayne, he's talking about himself, right? Or you yourself. Like, what can he be certain of himself? Just like me. What can I be certain of myself? And I'm saying, I'm thinking right at this moment. And that in itself proves that I am real. You could say...
Yeah, I don't buy that.
You can say a fictional character is, somebody claims he thinks, and we can never be certain of other people's, you may claim to be a thinker, and yet that doesn't prove to me that you exist, but the fact that I am thinking...
I think that's wrong. It should not be sufficient to prove to you that you exist.
And why not? Because what you just said as far as a fictional character goes, that I don't see it in the same class for that reason, but why... I know this is a side point, but I find it very interesting because I've never met anybody that questioned that reasoning.
It was reading Lewis, somehow I forgot his first name. David K. Lewis. And he's on the plurality of worlds, where he talks about why it is useful in philosophy to posit that all other possible worlds exist. And as part of his arguments, I started realizing that if we accept I think therefore I am for ourselves, we have to also accept it for our counterparts in other possible worlds. And there I'm not talking about fictional characters. I'm talking about our counterparts in other possible worlds in the way that Lewis defines them.
Well, how does the Cartesian demon apply to Detering here, though?
It doesn't, but Detering brings it up.
Okay, that's what I was trying to say. I think it's just superfluous. It's gratuitous.
I didn't want to get into a long discussion of that. I just meant to, something you can talk about to me about later is what I meant.
Yeah. It was too intriguing not to touch on it.
Exactly, yeah.
No, yeah.
I'd have to explain that more later. Anyway, I'm trying to find the next point of... here's where he talks about Antiqua matters in chapter 2 here. Bolin. Yeah. I didn't really follow Detering. I was just reading this too quickly of why Antiqua matter was important to him and what he got from it.
Well, I think the reason why he thought it was important is because when he started reading the writings of the Dutch radicals, the Antiqua matter is a book that kept coming up in his reading, in his footnotes and things. And
so he's saying that Bolin had a copy and was referencing it. Okay, but who wrote Antiqua matter? I missed that here.
His name was Edwin Johnson. I read it after I read the first time the Detering book. I read it, and it's an old book. And basically, the Antiqua matter it argues that the first true anchor of historicity of either Paul or Jesus or any of Christianity or any of it is Justin, and that because of that, there's no such thing as apostolic succession. And he basically lays the groundwork for a mythicist understanding of Christianity that the Antiqua matter does. And I read it actually. It is a decent book. I think it's a fairly well argued, especially for the 19th century. But I don't see the special weird value that Detering puts on it. Like I said, he seems to kind of be more of a fanboy and he devotes like 3 pages to this. And I think it was kind of superfluous and beside the point. I mean, it's a good book. I recommend that people read it. But there's a huge problem surrounding that book, whereas the Antiqua matter is a really good book. the follow-up book that this gentleman, Edwin Johnson, wrote was this really weird theory about Paul. I didn't read it. I started to kind of read it, and I'm like, I don't know if I want to read this. It was this really weird theory about Paul being like from the Pauline writings dating to even later than that, to like the 4th or 5th century, like Paul being a 5th century invention or something like that. And I couldn't follow the argument, and I thought it was kind of quackery. So where I follow his first book, Antiqua Matter, and it made sense to me, a red flag was raised by the second book about what the hell is this guy on?
Gotcha. Yeah, 5th century. It sounds absurd to me.
Yeah, it was totally absurd to me, and because of this reason, Detering's veneration, let's say, of this book is problematic because of this.
Yeah. You can find good gems in writings that, in other aspects, are quite crazy. I mean, sometimes sometimes people stumble upon good stuff in the midst of their craziness.
Sure, yeah.
And even a broken clock's right, once or twice a day. So.
Yeah, I agree, and I try to keep that in mind when I read stuff by the freaks and Gandhis and the Arch-Hieretics of the world.
Yeah.
So.
I said once or twice because there are 24-hour clocks.
Yeah, right. So what else should we discuss here?
Now, page 90, he starts talking about Marcion.
Okay.
I don't have anything highlighted here. I started reading quickly and not highlighting those, so I don't.
Yeah, I highlighted a few things, but there wasn't really that much. Let's see. Because, yeah, we're already on chapter 2 now.
Yeah. We're supposed to be doing chapter 2 this hangout. We were catching up on chapter 1, so we got a late start on it.
Okay, Marcion is at the bottom of page 90.
Yeah.
He goes into Marcion a little bit, and luckily we've all been privy to Marcion literature because we did the Moll book, and we've read our own. I've read Tyson and Beydoun and all these other things. And the thing I'd like to say about Detering is, when I first read Detering, he seemed a lot more compelling to me on this particular section on Marcion, but I think it was because I was not as familiar with Marcion as I am now. And having read these other works about Marcion, I think that Detering is asking too much from Marcion.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of his discussion. Most of it seems to pretty much parallel what we read elsewhere. I don't think he's saying anything about Marcion himself that is radically different than what we get from Beydoun or Moll.
Well, he is. He is, but the only thing that he's saying that's different is he seems to think that Marcion was the composer of the letters.
Yeah, exactly. But
yeah,
about the background, facts.
Right. Yeah, he doesn't say anything that's groundbreaking about Marcion.
So if the 200,000 sesterces were returned, the ones who tried to pay to the Church of Rome, does it say what they were spent on after they were returned?
No, but you just you brought up a good point that made me think when I was reading through this about. I think that it's a valid link to make that I hadn't really thought of before. Between, in other words, we don't know that Marcion used his own money to contribute to 200,000 sesterces to Rome. We don't know that.
Exactly.
We kind of take it for granted, and I think Moll takes it for granted that he was rich enough to do that. But there's something to be said about the parallels between the collection for the poor in the Pauline epistles. I think it's a possibility that should not be glossed over. That this was a similar kind of a collection on Marcion's part to bring over to kind of use as clickbait, let's call it, for the church at Rome. In other words, here's some money. Hey, you should make me part of your thing. Is that what Paul was doing in the epistles? Here's some money, guys. Can I be in the show?
Yeah, there's similarities there.
Yeah,
There's,
and I thought
there's also the claim that Simon Magus was trying to buy his.
right. And so because of those, there are some similarities that I think there's something to what he's saying there.
Yeah.
Even though we can't prove it, but it's an interesting conjecture.
Yeah.
What's the idea behind that? I mean, what the motivation? Would it be that? I'm wondering why would an Orthodox writer write that up in Acts in a favorable way, Paul's actions, when it really is applying to Marcion? Is this an attempt to appeal to the Marcionite community, if they could even see the connection between what Marcion did and what Paul is being portrayed to have done?
Wayne, do you want to take that, or?
You take it.
Was I clear on what I asked?
Yeah, can you rephrase it, because I
didn't catch it either.
Ask it again, please.
Okay, I'll try. I guess I'm trying to think of what would be the motive of the Book of Acts, of the writer of Acts, to write Paul's taking up a collection for the church, which is presented in a very positive way. What would be the motive of doing that when the church itself was not open to accepting Marcion's gift? What would be the motive of the writer of Book of Acts in portraying it in such a positive way?
Well, the motive would be, I think, the knowledge of the Pauline epistles, which all mention this collection.
The writer of Acts might be trying to say that the church isn't against accepting money. It's just, it's implying, without explicitly saying it, that it's just against accepting it from heretics. That, from a legitimate source, they'd be willing to accept such money. So maybe,
you're saying...
maybe Acts is accepting it from Paul, just as a way for the church, to cover itself for rejecting Marcion's money.
It's plausible, I suppose, but I don't find it particularly compelling.
Yeah, I'm just speculating.
Yeah.
What you're suggesting, though, is that if in this theory of Detering, Marcion wrote the Gospels of Paul, and he's portraying his own contribution to Rome, he's putting that he's attributing that to the character of Paul, and then Acts, when the Orthodox Church basically takes over the letters of Paul as theirs, they incorporate this expression from Paul's letters. But Marcion wrote them, and Marcion's really referring to his own action.
Well, Detering seems to think this, I guess, but I could see a connection of the Pauline, the Acts, or I'm sorry, let me see how I can get this straight here. It's kind of confusing, isn't it? He seems to think that it's an echo. One is an echo of the other, but he also seems to think that Marcion will go with him as far as that, and so that's kind of why it's problematic for me. In other words, if Marcion is not the author, then it doesn't reflect the Marcionite money. Do you follow?
Right, I think so.
But if Marcion is the author, then it could be a direct link. But if Marcion is not the author, then I think it's irrelevant.
Marcion or a disciple of Marcion, you said that that's also something he's...
Right, yeah. He does hedge it that way. He says it was either Marcion or somebody who was of importance in the Marcionite circles.
But if that was true, then would he be saying, generally speaking, that Marcion's portraying himself in the character of Paul?
If Marcion would be the author, that would be by necessity, I think. Yeah, it would be a direct emulation, let's say.
Yeah, because he's not limiting. It would be strange if it's just limiting. He's just limiting this particular thing, the collection, to something he had done. It would fit in. It would fit in better if he's picturing himself throughout the whole letters as Paul.
Yeah, but like I said before, I don't follow Detering on this. I don't think that Marcion wrote them, and so I think he inherited them. But nevertheless, there's an interesting echo there. The collection for the poor versus the collection for the church. in Rome.
Right, right.
Because Jerusalem, for the poor in Jerusalem, specifically Jerusalem was the center, right? And by Marcion's time, Rome was the center, so there's also that parallel.
Right. And Wayne, you're bringing up the idea that, I mean, Moll and others have insinuated this idea that Marcion was wealthy and that's where the money came from, but you're just pointing out that this could have been a collection. This could have been a collection from the churches similar to Paul's in that sense, right? It's not.
Yeah,
that's what Detering mentions as a possibility.
That's what Detering is. Yeah, that's what Detering is hinting at.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I never considered that before, but it actually does sound quite feasible, actually.
Yeah, I thought that was a moment where I said, yeah, I never thought of that. That's cool.
I mean, these 200,000 sesterces is like several $1 million in modern U.S. currency equivalent.
Yeah. So that's what he says. It's like, I don't know how many, but it's a bunch of millions.
Yeah. And could people in ancient times really be that rich? I mean, even if they did get themselves? I mean, is that within the realm of reason for wealthy people in ancient times?
It's it's defensible. I mean, he could be like this completely magnanimous personality who said, "Here's $1 million," but that's not as. I think it's more reasonable to suppose that there was some kind of a institutional organization behind it.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, Bill Gates can donate $1 million, no big deal. But being that we don't know that much, we think we know about Marcion's life, but we really don't.
Yeah.
It's to say that he donated the money himself because he was a rich man. It can be nothing but a speculation.
Yeah, but I mean, in modern times, we have an economy, where the top 1% can have over half of the nation's wealth. There's very high wealth imbalance in modern times. But is that also the kind of thing that could happen in ancient times or not? Or did only governments have that degree of wealth in ancient times? I don't know. I'm just asking.
Reuven just wrote on the side, Pontian aristocracy benefited from being the connection between West and East. Any rich person from that region would be just as rich as someone in Rome. Or, well, just as rich as some rich person in Rome, I suppose, but not everybody was rich, I don't think.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether that answers my question or not. I don't.
Yeah.
It might be completely plausible for people to be that rich. I'm just wondering if the sociology and economics of that time, how that works.
Yeah, I think it's possible, but I don't think it's been demonstrated. It's as plausible. Let's put it this way. I think it's as plausible as a collection is.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go with that.
Yeah.
Detering is talking about Marcion's two gods theory. That there's the higher god and the demiurge are separate gods. It seems to be standard stuff there. I don't think Detering did anything unique in that section. And then Detering asks, when did Marcion become a heretic? I didn't highlight anything here, but I can't remember if he said anything interesting here.
Yeah, here I'm actually on his. If the two options are Detering's or Moll, Moll argued that Marcion became a heretic and basically started his movement in 144, and I don't think that's true. I think that Detering is correct in saying that he started earlier, and by the time he got to Rome, he was trying to exert his influence in Rome, and it backfired.
Yeah, I think he was coming to Rome to represent his churches and try to try to get a unity between the two branches of Christianity, whatever, and that
I think
in his attempt to do that failed.
I think on that point, I think Detering is more correct than Moll. Yes.
Yeah. So basically, I think he was an ambassador of his church in a way. I'm just looking for the next thing of interest here.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Marcionism and Gnosis, and I'm sorry I read this so quickly I forget what Detering had to say about it.
Oh, I think to remember, I think that's something we didn't really talk about when we were discussing Moll. Hold on, let me take a
Is
look.
it fair to call Marcion a Gnostic, or was his theology,
I don't think.
significantly distinct from other Gnostics?
I think that Marcionite theology was not indebted to Gnosticism. I don't think the second God was the same thing as the Gnostics, or maybe eventually they appropriated Marcion and changed it. But I think that Marcion was not much of a Gnostic. As a matter of fact, I think Marcion was. He doesn't seem Gnostic to me. He's not worried about eons. He's not worried about pleromas. He's not worried about gnosis. That's not really what Marcion is about, as I see it.
Another thing that...
But some of those terms do come up in Paul's epistles. They're not fleshed out the way the Valentinians flesh them out,
Right.
but the pleroma is used by Paul. I mean, gnosis is used by Paul.
Right, yeah.
Another thing
Yeah.
I just wanted to throw in there that came up earlier in the week on a Facebook thing that I posted a question about Paul and Marcion. Basically, how could Marcion take some certain positions if he thought Paul, believed in a, how did I put, something to the effect of if Marcion thought that the God of the Old Testament was evil, and he couldn't view the Old Testament as sacred, and yet Paul, who he loves, seems to take the Old Testament as sacred scripture, and Paul doesn't seem to think that the God of the Old Testament is evil. And so several people pointed out that this is a difference between Marcion and the Gnostics, is that they don't think Moll was right in this. They believe that Marcion believed that the Old Testament God was just.
Yeah, I agree.
Opposed to evil, and the Gnostics criticized Marcion for that.
Yeah, I think so. I think that whereas Moll argued very well that the second God was, or the first God was, the God of the Old Testament, I don't think that he made a sufficiently compelling case that the first God was evil God. I think that it had to do more with justice and retribution, but that's not necessarily evil. We only transpose it as evil because we know what the Gnostics would develop the concept into. You see what I'm saying? But
right. We read that into Marcion, but it's not there.
Right. And I think, yeah, that's one of the points that I had against Moll. Okay, so where are we now?
I've skimmed up to page 100.
When did Marcion become the heretic?
Paul's talked about. Detering's talking about Marcion. I don't know what to comment on in that. He takes quite a few pages talking about that, but it seems to be basic stuff.
Yeah, there's nothing really ground shaking there. Then he goes into Marcion's discovery, which he seems to think. Marcion's discovery of the epistle to the Galatians is a big piece of the puzzle for Detering, because that's one of the main. At least he devotes some writing to it. That it leads him to believe that Marcion was the originator of the epistles.
Yeah. There's something that Detering writes that I'm wondering if it's not anachronistic, but I don't know. It's up on page 100 above the discovery section, the paragraph before that.
Okay. Here we would.
At that time, it was necessary to legitimate the developing church and to appear to documents that derived from Christ and the apostles. That seems almost anachronistic to me as a way to legitimize things. I'm trying to fit that into my big picture. That makes sense after the Gospels are written, but it doesn't make sense before the Gospels are written, at least in my mind.
To legitimate The developing church. Yeah, I'm trying to make sense of this.
I mean, the idea that things have to, to trace directly back to Jesus or directly to his apostles, it seems to me that has to be a post-gospel phenomenon. And I don't believe the Gospels were that early, so.
Well, it is a post-gospel phenomenon, but I mean, which Gospels? I mean,
Yeah.
would the Gospel of the Lord or Marcion's Gospel qualify?
Possibly. Yeah, I need to fit that into the big picture in my mind. But I'm trying to see why Detering used this appeal, what he was trying to argue that he brought that up.
It seems to me that the argument about those the discovery of Galatians, it reminds me of like Galatians is Marcion as Deuteronomy is to Josiah.
I knew you were going to say that.
You know? Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because at least that's the feeling I'm getting from what Detering wrote there.
Yeah. I'm not familiar enough with the passage in Tertullian to know if he's reading that right. But now,
so I think, well, he makes a semantic argument.
The Galatians. Yeah.
He makes a semantic argument that the word for discovered implies something that was unknown before. But that could be just a semantic blunder on his part, on Tertullian's part.
Yeah. Well, no, Detering says it means to attain by accident.
Right.
Yeah.
By the way, do you know what Dr. Price thinks on... I mean, I know that he doesn't think that any of the Pauline letters are genuine, but does... And I've heard him talk in terms of Marcion writing certain parts of Romans, I thought. But do you know if he thinks that Marcion wrote Galatians?
I remember him mentioning that he wrote partially, some part of it, but I couldn't tell you exactly what part. Or at least I seem to remember him saying something like that.
Yeah, I still want to read The Amazing Colossal Apostle. I started reading it and then realized I wanted to read some more basic stuff first. That's preparation for it. And I haven't gotten back to it.
I haven't. Maybe I should take a look at what he says about Galatians right now.
Can you? I missed the first half of that. Can you say that again?
I own The Amazing Colossal Apostle. I should probably take a look at what Price says about Galatians and if he says anything about Marcion. You know, this discovery of...
yeah, I have a hard copy too.
That'd be cool. I seem to remember him taking a similar stance on it as Detering. That although it's only a speculation, it's a compelling one.
Mm-hmm. The next section, I strongly agree with what Detering's getting at, and yet I question Detering's choice of arguments. It seems like the strongest arguments for it are ones that Detering's not mentioning, and the ones that Detering does mention seem kind of weak to me.
Yeah, I see your point there because you and I have both been reading on Marcion, and so we have this fresh in our minds.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's clear to us from Couchot and from others that they're obviously Catholic interpolations and not the other way around.
Yeah.
And I agree with you that I don't think Detering made as good a case for those things as either Couchot or Bédune or Tyson or whoever.
Yeah. I was actually kind of almost bewildered the particular choices that Detering is making for his argument.
So this may in fact be an illustration of what you said earlier about a broken clock being right twice a day.
Yeah.
By the way, let me read you this in the beginning of Galatians in Dr. Price's Amazing Colossal Apostle.
Yeah.
He says, following von Manen, I take Marcion as the author, partly because of the striking comment of Tertullian. Marcion has discovered Paul's epistle of the Galatians. Tertullian later adds that Marcion discovered the epistle of Paul to the Galatians, uses it to, quote, destroy the character of these Gospels, which are published as genuine and under the name of the apostles. if we take the word discover in its literal sense, these comments could imply that no one had seen the epistle before, and that, like Hilkiah, who discovered Deuteronomy, which is what you were talking about, or Joseph Smith, who discovered the Book of Mormon, Marcion wrote the core of Galatians, chapters 3 through 6, and posed as Paul to the audience of early followers who were beginning to yield to the propaganda of Catholicizing Christianity. So he agrees with Detering on this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
and so does Maimon.
I could see where the argument could be made, but I think it's just as plausible, a little less, a little more. I don't know. That Tertullian just made a semantic blunder there. And
by the way, he says it is the. By the way, like you, I also was thinking of Josiah and discovering of Deuteronomy. I think we all did when we read that. But Price says it is the Catholic devotion to the Torah that Marcion combats, not necessarily the attachment to the Hebrew Bible that a Jewish Christian might hold. So anyway, that's apparently what he thinks is the main reason why Marcion would write this.
No, yeah, I mean, I think that Marcion didn't write the epistles, but I'm open to persuasion, you know. I mean, and it seems to me that Robert Price has a decent case there that he's trying to build, but I mean, I guess I would have to explore it further.
And he said he doesn't think that Marcion wrote the first two chapters, but that later edition. He says the first two chapters are later editions by Marcionites who wanted to counter the story of Paul as in Acts, where Paul had been co-opted by Catholic Christianity.
Right, and by the way, this point right here is exactly the reason why somebody would think that they were feeding off of each other. By the way, Wayne.
Gotcha.
Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'll look that up. I'll look that up in the Amazing Clothing Apostle and study that later.
Yeah, but that's one of the reasonings.
Yeah.
It's that polemical nature of he's so opposing something about this nascent church.
But they're taking two chapters to be a separate stratum from the rest of Galatians in order to have that theory.
Right. Yeah, I think it necessitates that. Yeah.
And I'm not sure if I can follow that or not. I'll have to think about it.
By the way, I should have probably read right before he says that the one sentence right before that, because I started in the second sentence. He said numerous contradictions and anachronisms in Galatians imply that the work is multi-layered, having gone through the hands of various redactors, and that even the original nucleus was pseudepigraphical. So he's suggesting that internal contradictions show that the first two chapters are later than the rest of it, in addition to redactions later on.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's very much worth looking into. Yeah, I'll do that. Now, I don't have anything to say about it now, except I look into it. I don't know much about that line of argument.
Yeah, right on.
On page 103 of Detering, he gives some of his evidence for the Pauline letters being reworked from a Catholic perspective. But the first example he gives, it really confuses me as an example. Galatians 2:5, and And I'll read this from what Detering has it. But not even Titus, who is with me, being Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. This is Galatians 2:3-5. But on account of the false brethren secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom which we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might enslave us, to whom we did, in brackets, not yield submission for a moment, that the truth of the gospel might be preserved with you. Now, what Detering seems to be saying, which I don't follow, is that the version with the word not is part of the Marcionite original of this, and that the Catholics took the word not out. And Detering gives, reasons why it makes sense, why they'd be motivated to take that out. The problem I have with this is I look in my own Bible, my own just standard off-the-shelf Bible, the nots are included. The NIV has the not, the King James seems to have the not, my Greek, the USB 3rd edition, which is what I have reference for, includes the not. They give it a B rating as being original. So I'm sorry. If the Catholics supposedly took this out, why is it not still in all the Catholic manuscripts?
There's a footnote there. I'm gonna look at the footnotes.
So it looks like, if anything, this is a later, scribal error possibly or something, but it has nothing to do with the stratum of interpolations that Couchot was talking about. Because the stuff that Couchot was talking about would not, is a comparison between what's in the reconstructions of Marcion versus our earliest Catholic manuscripts. But this, here, the Catholic manuscripts and the Marcionite match. So I'm not sure what difference, Detering's referring to. At least early on they match.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think I just looked at a footnote that he has on there, and it doesn't really make sense of what I'm trying to find.
Yeah. I mean, I find Couchot's argument, based on Romans 1:18 being a misunderstanding of a word in Romans 1:17. I might have the verse numbers off by 1 or 2. Maybe I'm thinking 18 versus 19 versus 18, but there's a passage in Romans, the end of chapter 1, where it takes the incorrect meaning for the word katakontron in the previous verse. That in the one verse it means to hold on to or to have. No, it means to suppress. I mean, it means to to kind of suppress or to hide in a way. But the interpreter takes it as meaning to possess and to have.
Right.
And it has both meanings, but it's clear that the writer of the first half of that chapter meant it one way, and somebody else writing the second half of the chapter and the beginning of chapter 2 meant it a different way. And that's just the kind of evidence that Couchot mentions, to say
right.
that the Catholic version has to be secondary.
Well, it's evidence for that kind of interpolation for sure.
Yeah. But I don't see any of that kind of argument in Detering here, which really surprises me, even though he's making the same point.
It's true. That's actually a good point.
Now he argues that Galatians 1:18 through 24 is an interpolation. I checked that in Badun, and it's unattested. I hate this all being unattested. I wish Badun would say, Tertullian says this was absent, with an omission. Marcion took this out.
Right. Yeah.
But it's unattested. There's nothing saying it was absent. Nothing saying it was present in Marcion.
As long as it's unattested, we must give it a Bayesian probability of 50-50 at best.
Yeah. But there is good, just the textual analysis here. It looks like an interpolation. I mean, I agree with Detering. I mean,
yeah.
2:1 seems to follow on 1:17, and verses 1:18 through 1:24 seem to be just intruding.
Yeah, I think
on the passage.
I think his argument is valid here.
Yeah.
At least to my eyes, it does. I could see that as an interpolation. It does make sense to me.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of the interpolations in Josephus, where it says, and just about that same time, another calamity befell.
Yeah.
It continues off where it left before the Jesus reference.
Yeah, and I think this is a good argument for the interpolation. For the Catholic version being secondary to the Marcionite version of the epistles. I think Couchot gave better arguments, but this is a good one here.
I think it's valid. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Where are we now? Are we on?
I'll skip past 105, looking at 106.
Okay.
He talks about the purpose of the interpolation, to remove the sovereignty from Paul and make him dependent on Jerusalem. I sped read these last sections,
Right.
trying to see what was in them, so I didn't really make many highlighting or comments.
Yeah, would you look, I guess this is the opening of Romans. Romans 1:1, 1:2, 1:3. Basically, as far as he's concerned, Romans 1:1 or 1:2 to almost until 1:7.
I think 1:7 is original, but I think 1:2 to 1:6 is interpolation.
Right, and that's the same point that he's making.
Yeah.
He's saying that people say that he's citing something.
Yeah.
But he doesn't see it that way. He thinks that it's this expensive related overbearing.
Yeah, I've always thought that verses 2 through 6 here were written by the same person who interpreted Romans 1:18 through 2.
Yeah, but it's a Catholic interpolation. Is the whole claiming that he's from David or whatever.
Yeah. I think the evidence for Romans 1:18 through 2:1 or 3, I think the 2:1.
And by a side note,
it's a stronger case, but that once we know there's an interpolation in this letter, positing others becomes more plausible. We already have one, so why wouldn't there be others with it?
I have a bit of a side note. If it is an interpolation, then it weakens the any historicist argument, which claims that this is talking about, the seed of David and all that stuff being evidence for historicism.
Yeah, all those verses have this problem. Even the James, the brother of Jesus passage, has the same problem. They're all passages that weren't in the Marcionite version.
I agree, and I think that that's something that cannot just be glossed over. I think it's really important. If it's missing from the Marcionite text, then they even that what little case they have regarding the fleshness, meatness of Jesus, is an interpolation.
Yeah. Yeah,
but even I would even say that. Sorry, go on.
Go.
I was just going to say that that seems to be the strongest case for historicity that some people have is the case from meatness in Paul, and if it is an interpolation, then but I even think that even if it is not an interpolation, there's not much evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, but I checked this before when I was reading Doherty and stuff. Doherty tries to defend some of these verses by interpreting them in some weird ways in some places, but I think pretty much across the board they're interpolations. So I think the Christ myth theory can just say they're interpolations and just sweep them aside.
Yeah, but the only problem with that though is
the people you're arguing against don't necessarily want to believe they're interpolations. They think
Yeah, but it's going to be a problem as long as people think that Marcion edited Luke.
Yeah,
it's going to be a problem. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. I'm just trying to see if I highlighted anything here of importance. Yeah, we have the question of on 110 here. I don't remember what context this is in. The only possible and sensible consequence is the recognition that the period of time between the author of the Pauline letters and the earliest Christian church was obviously substantially greater than we previously thought on the basis of our preconceived historical picture. So he's saying that we don't just have Christianity starting in the 30s and Paul writing in the 50s and 60s with only a couple of decades there. And I agree with that, but I place Christ as fictional and Paul as late first century. So
right.
And I think there's probably I think in 70 A.D. they were already proto-Christian Jewish groups already, and I think part of what I think the Gospel of Mark was written about that time period. it's basically saying that these other groups are the continuation of the kingdom of God. But I think in order for the Gospel of Mark to make sense that way, these groups have to have been established for a while. I mean, actually, they can't just arisen, that year. So I do think Christianity probably existed in the 60s, if not earlier.
Yeah.
But I'd say proto-Christianity, there's a continuum between Judaism and Christianity. I don't know exactly how to define it there, but a Christian tendency in Judaism already at that point.
I wouldn't go that far, but I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So I think there is enough time if Paul was written in the late 1st century for there, to be already, a generation or more of established Christian churches that he can, be in dialogue with.
Well, even like a hierarchical one.
Yeah.
A hierarchical one with bishops and all kinds of stuff, where to the point where he would go in 144 to Rome and be excommunicated.
That I'm not sure.
It's like, because how many decades? From let's say it's let's say Paul comes from the 80s or 90s or something, and then it's 50 more years before Marcion goes to Rome and there's already an established church. Is 50 years enough?
I think it is. I think
so.
A generation's enough. But I was talking about reading Paul and reading the Pauline epistles themselves, whether they are plausibly placed in the late 1st century, if there's enough time for there to be established churches for a historical Paul to be in dialogue with.
I was just going to ask you a question, but I might have the answer already. I was just curious why you guys are considering placing Paul so late in the 1st century. But is that?
I think the Book of Acts is polemical, trying to make him earlier, and I think once you discard Acts as being fictional, it's dating of Paul. I mean, we have to reevaluate the dating of Paul. And
we know when the latest is, but we don't know what the earliest is. But we know when the latest is.
Yeah.
Okay,
Marcion is the latest.
Okay, because I thought maybe, as I was hearing you talk, I thought maybe it's because Marcion made a claim to, like, being a disciple of Paul, or like, where does he make any claims about how removed he is from Paul, like in an apostolic succession, like he's 1 or 2 generations away from Paul?
You're talking about Marcion, or you're talking about Detering?
Marcion. In fact, that's why I thought maybe you guys are trying to move Paul later, so that
that might be part of my reasoning. I didn't really think through it that way.
Oh, okay.
I do think it seems that Marcion is not that long after Paul.
Okay. But to your knowledge, Marcion didn't make any specific claim of being a disciple of Paul's, or like Valentinius and I learned from him, or something like that.
No,
I can't say no. I think Marcion did make that claim. I can't think the reference to it though.
I'll see if I can find something.
No, I think Tertullian claims it on his behalf. I think
Okay.
Tertullian calls him an apostle to the heretics.
Yeah. No. Like I said, I don't know when if there was a historical Paul when he wrote. I'm just using the late 1st century as a starting point, and if I see reasons to revise that, then I will. Basically, I have very little evidence to go on, so I just want something as a working hypothesis.
Oh, something I should mention too: the famous story of was it Irenaeus saying, "Do you know who I am?" Not Irenaeus. Was it Polycarp saying, "Do you know who I am?" Yes, you're the firstborn of Satan. That to me kind of shows that Marcion did not get started in 144. He was already known as a heretic by the time he met the Romans.
Yeah. Unless that story is apocryphal, but yeah.
Right, of course, unless the story is apocryphal, but at least it lends me to believe that way.
Yeah.
Oh, Polycarp? Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, when did we place Polycarp? I was thinking late 2nd century for Polycarp. But should he be placed in early to mid 2nd century, earlier than I thought?
The reason why we think he's early is because he's mentioned specifically by Ignatius. But if Ignatius is spurious, then it's moot, isn't it?
Yeah. I picture in my head Polycarp being around 180 or so, but I could be way off on that. I don't remember what the basis of that is.
No, Polycarp. Irenaeus is about 180, which places Polycarp earlier than that into the one.
About 170-ish or 167. Okay.
But that would be a big problem, because if Ignatius is writing his letter in 110, 114 to Polycarp, and Polycarp, what's 167? The date that Polycarp did what?
Wikipedia says he died in 167.
He died. Okay.
They put his life as 80, from 80 to 167.
Which means he would have been how old in the time of Ignatius? In his 20s? I guess it's feasible. It's possible. But to be that much of an important bishop that Ignatius is writing you a letter in your 20s, I don't think so.
I can't remember where I got the 180 number from, so I'm just going to forget that now.
Well, I know that Irenaeus was writing in 175, 180.
So maybe I got him confused. That could be it.
Yeah.
So when are you placing his visit to Rome?
Who?
Marcion.
Or Marcion? It's pretty well attested. It's fairly well attested that it was 144.
144. And so what do you? So 144 in Rome. What is it that you were debating as far as you were suggesting that some date was too late?
Moll argued that Marcion was a traditional Catholic until he got to Rome, and when he got to Rome, he became a heretic, and that's when he was excommunicated, and that happened in 144.
Oh.
But if the story of Polycarp calling him the spawn of Satan is true and not apocryphal, then that means that Marcion definitely had to start before 144. Okay, enough to be known as a heretic by 144, which means he probably give him another 20 years, I'd say. I mean, how long does it take to become a worldwide known heretic?
Right. But now this is his visit to Rome in 144 is the time when he ran into Polycarp, right?
Yes.
So if Polycarp was born in 80, that means he was 64 years old when he ran into him.
When Polycarp was 64?
Right. In other words, he was born in 80, and then he met up with Marcion in 144. That means he's 64 years old.
But by that point, Marcion's already a worldwide known heretic. Is my point.
Right. No, I'm just pointing out the age that he would have been at that meeting. But I see your point that he couldn't possibly have just he couldn't possibly have left Catholic Christianity at that point.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's why I think Moll is wrong about that.
Okay, I didn't realize that that's what Moll said. I only read certain parts of Moll. Although, as I hear you, maybe that was good that I didn't read it too carefully.
No, it's cool. I'm glad I read Moll, because Moll was a really, really good review of the traditional picture. And I think it's important to know what the traditional picture is, and then knowing that that's what the traditional picture, when you read someone like Tyson or someone like Beydoun, you can kind of put that into perspective. But I think Moll was wrong about that. I think Moll wants to place Marcion.
Do you have a dating kind of system in your mind? When he became a bishop, for example, or
who? Marcion?
Yeah, because you're talking about redating Marcion from Moll. I'm just curious, the dating of Marcion. What are you thinking again?
No, I'm cool with him. You know, if he came to Rome in 144, and that's fairly well attested. I don't know. I think that he already had. He was already a heretic, but he wasn't condemned as one yet, apparently. And so, as far as his bishopric or stuff like that, I don't really know. I think he probably was already, but in his idea, bishopric was something different. And like I pointed out during the Moll group sessions, I think Walter Bauer was correct when he said that the Marcionites were the first variety of Christianity that a lot of cities in the East were exposed to.
Right.
And so, as far as the hierarchy of bishopric and stuff like that in the Marcionite church, I don't know how it applies to, if it had the same value as the Catholic counterpart. I don't know.
Okay. I thought maybe you had a timeline in your mind where you can say, I think he was a bishop by 110 or something like that,
No,
and he was already 60 years old when he met Polycarp or something like that.
I don't know. All I know is that it's earlier than Moll thinks. That's you know what I mean. I don't have any specifics, but I think it's earlier
Right.
than Moll. It's earlier than Moll says.
Okay.
I'm starting to think that maybe there wasn't an historical Marcion. Maybe Jesus, Paul, and Marcion are all fictional.
But then, wow, that would be something.
No, I'm joking. I'm joking.
Justin invented him.
Yeah.
And once you start denying your own existence, then we'll talk about what it means that I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
I know.
See, this
point,
applied more than I thought to this discussion.
Yeah.
No, at that point it becomes a Monty Python scheme. Wait, there's no S in Burt Bacharach.
We'll discuss that after this Hangouts, what I meant about Descartes, but I wouldn't deny my own existence. I just think it has to be established on a different basis than what Descartes' using.
But you're doubting Marcion and everybody else now. No, I'm kidding.
No, it's
Well, I mean, I think, after
I'm
Descartes,
wondering if possibly there's exaggeration here, though, in Tertullian and others, that maybe Marcion is just, a particular pastor among these Marcionite churches and stuff, which were already in existence before him. He was just, part of these. And they just made him their representative to go to Rome for them, as an ambassador for them. But that might be all he really did, and everything else could be apocryphal. Because he was a representative in Rome, the Catholics could have just, made him a stand-in for the churches in general. I'm just speculating here, but I think we got so many uncertainties about who Marcion was, maybe because of this. Maybe he was just, a preacher of one of these churches. Maybe they had a vote, who's going to go to Rome for us, and they chose him.
I wonder.
Maybe he was one among equals,
We don't know.
Not really the founder of those churches, but just one among equals in those churches. I'm just speculating, but yeah.
Yeah, we know. I think one of the things that I've learned about Marcion is that we just don't know a lot of what we think we know.
Exactly. So this whole thing about doubting everything, I wonder if we can doubt that. Whether we can doubt that Marcion was actually the founder of these churches, or just somebody they elected to be an ambassador for them. Is that plausible at all?
It's plausible, but given that we have no evidence.
Yeah.
It's not
not relevant. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Or at least it's one of the, let's call them a minor probability.
Yeah. I just wanted to be reminded what the evidence was against that theory. I guess is why I was asking it. Just because Tertullian asserts that Marcion did all these things, but I think a lot of what Tertullian asserts is all polemical, so I don't know how much of it I trust.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. What little we have is from polemicists. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, Detering here on 113 now is talking about Marcionite elements in the theology of the original Paul, without the Catholic insertions. And one thing that Detering's pointing out is that Paul and Marcion were both Docetists. They both, see that Jesus only had an apparent body, not a real body. And he quotes Romans 8:3, where God sent his own Son in a form that resembled sinful flesh. Martin Leon, okay. And he quotes Philippians 2:7, where Jesus came in the likeness of men and found an appearance like a man. And that wording seems to be, intentionally trying to skirt some issues on or to avoid saying that Jesus was a man. But I think there were lots of Docetists around, and I don't think the fact that there's Docetism in Paul is necessarily proof that Marcion wrote Paul. I think Docetism is just a popular view. Talks about 2 Corinthians 5:16. From now on, therefore, we know no one according to the flesh. But even if we once knew Christ according to the flesh, we now know him thus no longer. I'm not sure what all to make of that. Hey, Leon?
Yes, sir.
What do you make of the phrase, if we once knew Christ according to the flesh, in 2 Corinthians 5:16?
Can you point me to the page we're at?
In Detering, it would be on page 114.
Okay, hold on. From now on, we know now... 5:16?
Yeah.
Okay, right there. Hold on.
He's trying to argue that Paul just knows a spiritual Christ, and doesn't know him according to the flesh. But there's this phrase in there, even if we once knew Christ according to the flesh.
Right.
So what is meant by that phrase in your mind?
I haven't really given it that much thought, to tell you the truth.
Neither have I. Yeah, it seems like an important part of understanding that passage as a whole.
By the way, Wayne, does that passage occur in Badoon's version?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. A dollar says it's not.
Yes.
Yes, what?
Yes, Badoon has it in his version.
Oh, I lost a dollar. Okay.
Wow.
In brackets, Badoon has it, verse 14. For the Christos' love encompasses us, since we have come to the conclusion that one person died in place of all, hence everyone died. And he died in place of all, so that those who might live no more live in their own right, but rather... Oh, wait, this whole thing's in brackets, so maybe not, because it goes in brackets until 17.
Ah, so it's in brackets then.
Yeah.
See?
If any, 17, if anyone is in Christos, that is one, a new creation. The old things have passed away. Take note, all things have become new. That he does have attested.
So in other words, if it's in brackets, somehow Badoon only infers that it was there, but it's not quoted by any church father?
Exactly. Right. Badoon's including it because Badoon believes it's necessary to make sense of the surrounding context.
But that's important because, yeah, it would have been an important point to someone who believed in a historical Jesus for Paul to actually say that. In other words, Paul's acknowledging that there are people who believe in a historical Jesus, and Paul doesn't care about it. And that would explain why he shows no interest in the historical Jesus. This would be like a linchpin verse if you could prove that it was in the original Paul. But if it's not in Marcion, then that would indicate. It seems to me that takes away an important piece of evidence for the historic Christ.
But that's what I'm trying to get at in my question to Leon is this a verse that establishes historical Jesus? Because I think Detering's taken it to be the opposite. I think he's taking it to be that Paul doesn't think
like Paul doesn't think, he doesn't care about the flesh.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that supports the historical Christ.
No, I disagree because
he doesn't care about it.
No, it only supports the fact that some people think that there was such a thing as a historical Christ. Or historical Jesus.
Yes. At least it supports that.
Yeah.
footnote, the text note that Badun has on 2 Corinthians 5:11 to 16. He says it's unattested. Critics of Marcion, such as Tertullian, had good reason to skip over verse 16, which lends support to Marcionite positions.
Say that one more time. I missed that.
2 Corinthians 5:11 to 16 is unattested. Critics of Marcion, such as Tertullian, had good reason to skip over verse 16, which lends support to Marcionite positions.
Ah, okay.
So I think Badun is actually thinking this probably was original to Marcion, but he's conjecturing it.
Right, but this actually marks the first incident where we've looked it up, and Badun seems to think it was there.
Well, he's bracketed a lot of these, and he brackets things when he believes they were there.
Right, but we have no
If he
attestation.
doesn't believe they were there, he won't include it in his main text.
Right, okay.
Like I said, I don't know about that phrase in the middle, though. Even if we once knew Christ according to the flesh, I don't know what that's actually really supposed to mean under any theory.
It sure seems to me, I know you disagree, but it sure seems to me that it's acknowledging that there was a historical Christ, but that's not important, and we don't understand him to be that way now.
Right, I understand that.
That way, he seems to be going beyond that. It's not important now.
Yeah, I get your reading.
I think I'd read it, though, as according to the flesh, modifying once new, not modifying Christ. I think it's adverbial, and talks about the way of knowing.
You mean just talking about a mistaken view?
Possibly, yeah. I've had that interpretation, and I think of a passage in Galatians. I think I read it that way.
So basically,
because Paul contrasts according to the flesh with according to the spirit in other parts of his writing, and according to the spirit often means through revelation and stuff. So I think according to the flesh needs to be read in a contrasting manner to that.
Well, that's why I had taken it as support for historical Jesus, is I thought he's contrasting. Historical Paul is writing this regarding this way of jabbing it to the Jerusalem church who grew up and, who basically were taught directly by Jesus, and he's saying that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If we knew him, like you said, the contrast between the fleshly Christ and the spiritual Christ. That's why I thought, I know you were against this idea last week, Leon, and maybe I am wrong in reading Paul that way, but it sounded like, in other words, my revelation came directly from the risen Christ, the spiritual Christ who knows much more than the fleshly Christ did. So my revelation is more impressive than yours. It goes
right, but that to me says that also to me says that there was no historical Jesus, because my vision is better than your Jesus, and so Paul's Jesus is definitely not historical.
Exactly, and everybody acknowledges that.
Right.
That Paul never met Jesus in the flesh, that is. But it seems to me that this would, if it were real, and if it was talking about if it's talking to...
Yeah, but if it were real, then it's non sequitur, because if there were a real Jesus, Paul's claim to a visionary Jesus would not trump it.
But I think that's what his intention is, to try to say it does. I know it wouldn't convince the Jewish church, that Paul's claims to a revelation trump our real experience with a real Jesus that we lived with for many years, and he taught us directly, and somehow you, who never met the guy, you never heard from him preaching, and yet you think your revelation is better. And it seems to me that that's... So they wouldn't be convinced by it, but it seems to me...
Right, but if you look at...
Making.
But if you look at the passage in 1 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, of the apparitions of Jesus to all the various people, right? First he appeared to Cephas, and then he appeared to whatever, and then finally to one, as one out of time, he appeared to me.
Right.
And in that passage, he makes no distinction between the appearance to Cephas or to James or to the 500. He doesn't make any distinction. To him, it's the same kind of appearance.
I agree with you on that case. So in other words, I think the resurrection appearances, when it comes to the resurrection appearances, Paul saw just the same thing as the others. None of them saw a physical Jesus. They all saw just a vision. But I think in Paul's in the case of this 2 Corinthians passage where he's talking about his revelation, not just that his revelation of seeing the risen Christ.
Yeah, I know, Dale.
The resurrection, which they all believed, but the priority of, or the basically the advantage of his gospel over theirs is it came directly from the risen, glorified Christ.
I get your point.
Truth, as opposed to this limited guy who had limited knowledge while he was on earth, and that's all you guys ever got.
Right, but here's my problem with that. Whenever to use those kind of weird, vague, ambiguous verses about Jesus' meatness, fleshiness, it seems to me that if the only references to Jesus' humanity is his meatness, and there's no biographical stuff at all, that's suspect to me because it just says, it seems to me that somebody's inserting meatness into the text that has no biographical info. And I don't think you're lending biographical credibility to someone by saying, oh, and by the way, he was made out of meat.
Yeah.
Well, they're made out of meat.
Follow me?
The made out of meat part, I assume you're talking about the beginning of Galatians. Are you?
Yeah, and even yes, but also in this verse, knowing him according to the flesh. The word is the same. It's sarx. It's meat.
But again,
and so the only time
that means nothing because again, flesh. If you're going to stress the meat as if that sounds ridiculous, he's talking about the flesh. The flesh and versus the spirit is a significant contrast in Paul's understanding of the advantage of the spirit over the flesh.
Yeah.
And he's saying, Jesus, I think he's saying,
I get your point, but I don't accept it just because it seems to me that whenever I need to have some biographical info. If somebody says the historical Hitler, don't just tell me, oh, and he was made out of meat. Even if you thought, you say Hitler, we think of Hitler as this great icon now, but even if we thought he was made out of meat before, it's not important because it's its teaching that matters. It's its spirit that matters. Yeah, but if you don't tell me anything else about Hitler, I don't have a reason to believe that Hitler's real.
And that's a bizarre thing to say to anyone. But
yeah,
I really think this entire interpretation of this verse and other verses in Paul is on the wrong track, and I think a lot of scholars have it on the wrong track. I think according to the flesh is an idiom that means according to human understanding.
That could be too.
I don't think it means we know him as being physical. It does not mean that. In fact, this verse right in front of us, 5:16, the first part of it doesn't make sense if we take it to mean physicality. For now on, therefore, we know nobody according to the flesh.
Right.
So he's saying that nobody is physical? He doesn't. That can't be what he's saying.
You've already convinced me just by that point.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But that's a really good point. It just makes no sense to me that the only reference to Jesus' humanity is he was made out of meat.
Yeah.
But
anyway. According to the flesh means without revelation. It means with human reasoning. In Paul, it means and according to the Spirit means with God's guidance and understanding. For understanding.
Okay. From the context, the way you described it, Wayne, I agree with you. But and it's probably a waste of my time, Leon, to address you again because we both agree with Wayne's interpretation of that.
Yeah.
But you keep stressing this, that he's made of meat business. It makes it sound ridiculous, and I think that's...
No, I do. Actually, you know what? I do that.
Extremely unfair because all he's saying is, yes, Jesus existed. That's all he's saying, right? If that's what he meant. Yes, he existed, but who cares? Oh, that's not important. Like to say he's made of meat. What are you talking? Why would you stoop to a level of? Yeah. It's just saying, if according to that theory, he was born. He lived. He's a historical being. Yes, that's like what you said with Hitler. Yes, he yes, he was a historical figure, but who cares? That's not the important thing.
And what I think this verse is saying is basically that we no longer understand Christ according, to a literal view of the messianic prophecies and stuff. We now have enlightenment and understanding of who the Messiah is. He's talking about changing from a more literalistic, Jewish understanding of the Messiah to a more Christian one, to a more spiritual one. And
do you think part of that is with a different view of the kingdom of God then?
Yeah. So I think when
what the messianic view was.
Yeah. When it talks about once knew Christ according to the flesh, I think it means, how I think about the Messiah. What the Old Testament talks about the Messiah. The understanding of the Messiah has changed.
I like your interpretation, Wayne. I do, but I want to answer Dale. The reason why I stress the meatness is because I think it has something to do with it. The fact that every one of these so-called biographical passages that describe Jesus as having been a human being on earth, they all have that connotation of meatness and or sperm of David, and it's always in this weird idiomatic way, which doesn't really tell me anything about a biography. It just tells me nothing other than, he was a dude. That's it. That's all they say. That's all it says to me. And if that's all it says to me, it says nothing.
Exactly.
I understand.
Yeah.
And that's why I stress meatness, because usually the common word to all these to these passages that we use to represent, that Bart Ehrman and whoever uses to represent the biography, they all seem to revolve around this concept of sarx. Flesh, meat. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it's a really bizarre thing to say about anyone, like Wayne just said.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sarx in Paul just means to be the unenlightened state of man, man without the guidance of the Holy Spirit, basically, in any sense.
And so when I stress the word meat, I think I kind of intended to sound a little bit.
Make it sound ridiculous.
Yeah, a little bit, because I don't think it's ridiculous, but I think it's asking too much.
Yeah. So I want to move on. Is the teaching of there being two different gods? I'm sorry, I'm getting a cough all of a sudden.
Paul and the two gods, I guess this is right up Margaret Barker's alley. Talking about the demiurge, the foreign god.
My question, I understand that Marcion had a concept of two gods, but can that really be found in Paul? I never thought you could find that in Paul. So if Detering is saying you can, that's new to me.
Dale, what do you think? Because I know you're a Margaret Barker fan, and did you find that convincing on her behalf? Or?
Well, the only thing that I started moving away from her on, possibly, is that I think she might be wrong, is this idea that Paul thinks that Jesus is Jehovah.
Okay, yeah.
But even if I think that those passages might be later interpolations by the Orthodox Church, I still think that Paul considers Jesus to be God, to be divine in some way.
Oh, I think that's for sure. I mean, but that's what happens.
Divine in some way is kind of wide open. There's lots of ways.
Divine in some way, he's like Moroni.
Yeah.
Right. So I have to think of where Paul may have claimed Jesus to be God. I thought he did, like the only begotten God.
That's in John.
That's in John. Sorry.
The pastorals do in a couple of places, but if we don't accept the pastorals, then we have a problem there, because that's the teaching of an already established church.
Yeah. When Paul talks about the aeon of this world, or the ruler of the power of the air, is he talking about the Marcionite demiurge, or does he have his own understanding of that?
Oh, you asking me or?
Either of you.
Then ask it again, please.
Does Detering have an opinion on that?
Detering is trying to say this is a commonality between Paul and Marcion.
The two gods?
Yeah, that Paul, refers to the aeon of this world and the ruler of the power of the air, that those are references to what Marcion would call the demiurge.
I think I probably offhand would agree with that, because I didn't disagree with the idea that Marcion believes that all I was pulling back from was thinking he doesn't think that the demiurge is evil, he thinks he's just, but see, so I'm starting to buy into Dr. Price's view of the ransom, for example, that because he's the creator, so all mankind are in his possession, and it's because of that he's the ruler of the world. And it's because of that that Jesus has to buy mankind back from him for the Father. It's because they naturally belong to the demiurge. He created them, he's the owner. That's the whole reason for the ransom, the whole reason Jesus had to come.
Well, I'm not buying Detering's argument that Paul is talking about the same thing as Marcion here. It seems that in Paul, the aeon of this world, the rule of the power of the air, is just Satan in the regular sense, and it doesn't place him as being creator. It doesn't place him as being the source of the Torah or anything of that sort, the way Marcion would have it.
That doesn't preclude the possibility that Marcion is interpreting Paul in this way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're looking at Detering's argument that Marcion wrote these epistles, and
because that's what he's trying to say. He's trying to say that that Marcion didn't pull it out of his head. Yeah. It's that he got it from Paul. It might be a misinterpretation of Paul, but nevertheless, he says that he's getting it from Paul himself.
Yeah, and there's another place where Detering confuses me. Detering's talking. This is in the bottom of page that I got to scroll up to find the page number 114. He's talking about Ephesians 3:9, and it talks about the mystery hidden for ages in God who created all things, but that the Marcionite version doesn't have in, and that the Marcionite version would have meant is hidden from the God who created all things.
We're coming by the way.
I don't get how you get from removing the word in. I don't see how the word from just magically appears. I don't see that.
Yeah, I think we're kind of getting closer to the ending of the chapter, and we're coming on the 3-hour mark, by the way.
Yeah, I got you. I'm trying to rush through this, but I wanted to.
But I will say I agree with you here, Wayne, that I think that here he's making not so strong an argument, and finally the last argument in this chapter has to do with the thing that I said about how he interprets the exclusivity as excommunication, and I think that's a weak argument on his part.
Yeah, that's actually the best argument that I've found in here so far from Detering, but I don't necessarily, I don't find it persuasive. I find it interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting, but it's interesting. It's something that you would never think of interpreting it that way, or at least I didn't.
But it's important. But it's important to me whether there are Marcionite type of statements within within Paul regarding the demiurge being as an evil god, or as creator and stuff, separate from the true God. I've never found that in Paul. So if Detering is saying that exists in Paul, that's new to me.
Well, I think he's
stretching.
Yeah, he's stretching it. I think I think it's not as obvious. I think it can be interpreted that way, but it's exegesis, it's eisegesis. It's whichever it is.
Yeah, and he says here that he thinks Paul was a rather domesticated child of Marcionism, and I really don't get that. Why would it have to be domesticated if it's just if it's written for the Marcionite's internal use originally? Am I missing something in Detering's argument there, or I don't know? That's about page 117-ish.
The domesticated Marcion, I see it. I don't remember actually taking any notes on that chapter or on that subchapter.
Yeah. He has interesting things about Paul not saving Jewish.
And I think he's right on that.
Too again, and and the thing about the headgear would be the one that would be most striking to me.
Yeah.
I guess among the Greeks, it was taboo for men to
cover their heads.
Yeah,
but it's always been part of Jewish practice.
Yeah.
Well, actually, the reference to use here, I would recommend Hiam Maccabee.
Yeah, okay. Can we reliably date the start of the Jewish practice?
I think. Did we talk about that here? About the head covering?
Yeah.
Huh. I don't know, but that's a good question. If we can trace that to the 1st century, then it would make Paul's Jewishness suspect.
Yeah.
By the way, you probably know that the Ebionites said that Paul was not Jewish, that he was a convert.
Yes.
So that supports that idea, at least. Although I don't know if they knew anything about the literal Paul, if he existed, or if it was his letters that they're interpreting.
So if the Ebionites talk about Paul, does Detering deal with that? Because that's important evidence on who Paul was.
He's mentioned him a couple of times.
Okay. I don't remember there being any citation of information about Paul from Ebionite. We don't have any extant Ebionite documents, though, do we?
I don't know where that comes from. I think that might be from a later church father that we know a lot about the Ebionites from.
Okay. Detering talks about Romans 3:9, and it's especially peculiar where Paul asks the question, which is usually translated, "What then? Do we have an advantage?" And I guess he uses this evidence that Paul's not Jewish, but I couldn't follow his reasoning on this.
Oh, he seems to think there's another one of those typos where a word was inserted and it changes the meaning, I think.
Okay, yeah, I have to say that again later, then I'll skip it for now.
By the way, Wayne, when we were talking about the question of whether Paul ever says that Jesus is divine or God, let's put it that way, this is text, I'm just curious if it's in Beduinus. 1 Corinthians 8:6, it says, "Yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and we exist for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through him." Seems to me he's claiming Jesus is the creator.
I'm not sure that's a fair interpretation of it.
Yeah, I think through him. I think it says through him, doesn't it?
It says, by whom are all things, and we exist through him. By whom are all things? In other words.
Yeah, I get that.
We came into existence by means of him.
Yeah, I think that is some indication of some attribution of divinity to him. But it's not necessarily just because it's creation doesn't necessarily make him a demiurge, though.
Yeah, you have to read Badun's notes in order to really get what he's going at. The notes are the more important part of the book. But I'll read this few verses from 1 Corinthians there. Chapter 8, verse 4. Concerning eating idol offerings, we know that an idol is nothing, and then he has ... Even though there are those who are called gods, whether in the celestial spheres or on earth ... But there is for us only one God, the Father, from whom comes all things ... Brackets. Nevertheless, there is not this knowledge in all persons ... Therefore, if food trips up my colleague, into brackets, I will absolutely not eat flesh forever, that I may not trip up my colleague. So the part about the mediators is not included by Badun.
Oh, okay.
Like I said, I have to read the text notes to actually get clear what Badun's thinking is.
Right.
Anyway, yeah, we are going on 3 hours here, and we need to rush through this. So I was trying to see anything important here.
We need to start wrapping it up because I need to take my meds.
Okay.
Yeah, we could end at any time and just pick up next time where we leave off.
He's talking about head covering. Okay, he's asking what use was made of holy letters in the 2nd century. Yeah, I guess we can just stop now and resume here. So
Yeah, you know what? And in the
so
meantime,
this is page
a
120.
bit of homework. A good bit of homework might be to research when was headgear required in Second Temple Judaism.
So
what page did you say, Wayne?
120. That's pretty close to the end of the chapter. It's only 8 more pages left in this chapter, or 7 more pages.
Okay. I think, well, considering that, we did pretty good.
Yeah. Hope we can have John with us next time.
Yeah, possibly, possibly even Doug or Shauna maybe.
It'd be nice to have Doug back also, yeah.
E, how long have you been here?
He got here a few minutes ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I have trouble keeping up the Hangout with me being, just, a third of it here. Or, as much of a third of it. I don't think I have that much to contribute, so I'm trying to force myself to say things I don't know what I'm talking about.
No, it's cool. I mean, considering that it's only 3 of us here, I think we did pretty good. I mean, we filled up the better part of 3 hours, so.
Yeah.
Cool.
You want to wrap it up then?
That's your job, Dale.
I've never done it yet. I'll allow you guys. Defer to you.
That's all cool. I guess we'll continue on next week and finish up the last of the chapter and go into chapter 3 of the Fabricated Paul. Thank you guys for being here and moving this discussion along with me. And I guess we'll see you next week.
Good night, everyone.
The Biblical Criticism Book Club.